Thank you. Thank you. I love this home crowd. I'm looking out and I'm seeing my life pass before me. People who I haven't seen in a long time, people who I saw yesterday, and then folks who I don't even know I'm seeing yet. So it's great to be here. I thought I would talk a little bit about my reasons for writing this book, the origins of the book, and my motivations for doing the research, in my opening comments, not so much about the substance of the book, and then have the substance of the book come out through our dialogue with one another. If I think about the first time I had the idea that this inquiry might be an important one, it really goes back about 20 years. When my mother was 72 years old, my mother now is 94 years old, and she lives, as she puts it, on her own in the home that we grew up in, that she calls the homestead. And at 72, she called her 3 then middle-aged children to the homestead and said she had something important to say. And we gathered around the dining room table as we always do, the 3 of us, my older brother, Chuck, who's 17 months older, my younger sister, Paula, who's 17 months younger. We've all been called firstborns. And she said that began the conversation by saying that she wanted us to know her. She wanted us to know who she was at 72 years old. She had a sense that our view of her was stuck way back in the past. It was anachronistic, it was old-fashioned. She wanted us to know her fears, her dreams, her wishes, her plans, her anxieties, her challenges. She wanted us to know her now. And we greeted this news. First of all, we were really quite surprised by it. I was a little bit defensive because she had, in fact, produced and raised 3 attentive children who had grown up to be 3 attentive middle-aged people. And we were good listeners. We thought we knew her story. We thought we asked good questions. We thought we had really inherited the empathetic gene. And I was particularly defensive because just a few years before that, I had written a book about my mother. I had spent 2.5 years in the field, as it were, that is, at our homestead, talking to her, talking to my father about their lives, reviewing all the many, many documents, observing her in her work. And I thought, how much do I have to know about my mother? Is that not enough? But that book really stopped when she was about 35 years old, when her children were young, and she felt as if we were not current. At that moment, I realized that life is long and that learning is continuous and that there is a plasticity of learning throughout life, and that one of the things that we need as we grow, as we learn, as we develop, is for others to recognize the growth in us, to be able to tell our story, to move from the past to the present. So I had this feeling that I wanted to know more about what it felt like at this age that my mother was, to be learning something new, to be having new dreams, to be making new plans, to be reinventing herself. And then several years ago, more recently, it seemed to me that every party I went to, every dinner I went to, all the cocktail events, the conferences, the professional meetings, at some point, the person next to me would lean into me, people of a certain age, now I realize, in their 3rd chapters between 50 and 75, and they would talk about something extremely exciting to them, about which they were passionate, a new adventure, a new risk, a new angle, a new course, a new discovery. And they would tell me about this in such a different voice from the voice that they talked about their ordinary work in. And it was a voice that was filled with passion and energy and intrigue, and it was also a voice that was filled with reticence and secrecy and mystery. It was almost as if, in terms of the reticence and shyness, people were saying, don't take me too seriously. I mean, I don't take me too seriously. in this very youth-obsessed society, it was almost as if people felt a little shy about saying they wanted to do something new. They wanted to embark on a new adventure. They wanted to reinvent themselves, because we are supposed to feel a sort of sense of decline and retreat and descent, or at least we're supposed to be collecting ourselves and sitting still, right? And so I began to wonder what these, as I began to call them, confessional moments were all about, what the text of these moments were and what the subtext of these moments were. And I wanted to discover this, something about this strange combination of exuberance and shyness, of incredible passion and reticence. And so I did what academics do when they discover a good set of questions. And that is, I returned to the literature about lifelong learning. And I'll just talk about two pieces of literature, that I found particularly important as I began to think about developing this inquiry. The first, of course, most all of you know in this room, was a return to Erik Erikson and his notion of lifelong learning as 8 stages. And the way he conceptualizes it is that at each stage, there is the opportunity for progression or regression, and that we are in crisis as we manage that tension between progression and regression. And he said that for the years that I was anticipating questioning, those years, the 3rd chapter, that's a time in which we face generativity versus stagnation. Sound really dramatic. Generativity versus stagnation. By generativity, he meant what I began to call giving forward in various ways to society: teaching, mentoring, parenting, grandparenting, tutoring, serving. But he also meant innovation. He also meant artistic expression, all the ways in which we might express ourselves with meaningfulness, with purposefulness, with energy, and with focus. And the option, if we don't do that, is stagnation, sitting still, being in a rut, being in routine, having the habit of habits. And this tension doesn't immediately get resolved in a moment where we're liberated to move forward. He talks about it being sort of imperfect and incremental. We struggle with it, right? And we're often moving forward and then feeling ourselves slipping back. The other literature that I looked at was a literature that really combines the kind of energies of an interdisciplinary group of scholars who call themselves lifespan theorists, historians, anthropologists, demographers, sociologists, psychologists, who talk about lifelong learning, the plasticity of learning through life, and they don't talk about it as staged. It's a much messier process. But they do say that there is no time in life when we are not able to embark on learning. There is plasticity of learning, and there's no particular primary moment when it's best to learn. The other thing they say, the second thing they say, is that learning in the second half of life becomes more complex, more multidimensional, more layered. It is almost as if it's about not going farther and faster, but going deeper. Or it's almost as if it's like saying, we want to become wise, not just smart. And then the third thing that lifespan theorists say that affected me was that we're not, in terms of our learning and development, we're not only determined and shaped by those sort of interior things, our cognition, our soul, our heart, our bodies, but also by the cultural, social, political, and economic context that surrounded us as we came into being, right? So that we are shaped, as all sociologists and anthropologists will tell us, not only by the interior life experience, but very much by the context within which we grow up. We are shaped by that. And so that all of the sort of considerations of development must consider our embeddedness in that context. And for those of us who are boomers, who were born in the 40s and the 50s, we were born at a time when we really thought we could make a difference, We were audacious, we were energetic, we were purposeful, we were aggressive, we were entitled, we were bodacious, right? We thought that because of our work and our commitment, we stopped the Vietnam War. We thought that we were an essential part of the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement. We experienced together as a collective group the deaths of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Kennedy brothers. So that there were these experiences as a collective that really determined our collective human development. And those of us who are boomers who are now in our third chapters, we bring this same kind of audaciousness and energy and commitment and belief that we can make a difference to the scene. So those two kind of developmental perspectives very much influenced the ways in which I began to think about doing this work. And then, of course, the demographics loomed large. We recognized that the whole sort of shape and arc of our lives have shifted because we're living longer, and we're living healthier, and we're living more energetically. And the health sort of, I mean, it's not as good as it should be. We can get off into that later. But our health care is better. And so rather than thinking of this 25-year period, the third chapter after young adulthood and middle age, as the last chapter, we think of it as the penultimate chapter, as the next to the last chapter. And that makes us think about these 25 years very differently. Those need to be years of purpose and energy and ambition and meaning. And demographers, in fact, tell us that a developmental period is invented every century. Last century, we invented and named adolescence. And it had a particular kind of cultural construct for us. It became that was imprinted on our families, our schools, and our communities. This century, demographers say, this is ours. This is the century for naming, claiming, proclaiming, understanding this construct of the third chapter, when we are neither young nor old. And in fact, the numbers are, the arc of life shifts, but also the numbers are extraordinary. In fact, every day, 10,000 baby boomers turn 60. So there is this big bulge of population that come to this experience, both in terms of the cultural context in which they grew up, but also in terms of their interior development. So I began to think that I wanted to move out into the world, out into the field, and really talk to people about this new learning. And so for 2 years, I spent a lot of time observing, witnessing, questioning, asking the probing and impertinent questions, watching, examining people as they were learning something new. I talked to 40 men and 40 women about their new learning and tried to understand what motivated them, what were their challenges, what were their inhibitions, what were their fears, what was surprising, what was mysterious, what were their epiphanies as they experienced this time, what were the kinds of things which they couldn't learn. How did it feel to move from an experience of working that is competitive, that's individualistic, that's achievement-oriented, that's about status, going up the ladder of success, to the kind of work, a very different kind of work that's collaborative, that's generative, that's about giving forward to society. So these were all the kinds of questions that I was eager to ask people who were in this period learning something new. It turns out that learning something new in this period is full of really interesting, poignant paradoxes. There is this experience of loss and liberation, of patience and urgency, of excitement and terror. There's this experience of it being the hardest work you've ever done and the most exuberant play. Always constancy and change, and this sense of it being childlike and very mature. One of the central paradoxes of several that I look at in the book, and in some ways each chapter is sort of framed around some paradoxes, is one that I call going home and giving forward. I talk about giving forward rather than giving back, because part of what I'm interested in is how people think about their altruism, their service, their sense of leaving a legacy and making an impact as something they're imprinting on the world now and in the future, not looking backward and taking care of something that by then is long out of date. This requires, for most people, that they become engaged in cross-generational projects, cross-generational relationships, discourses, encounters, that they work together with people of other generations to produce something, and that they depend on younger generations to keep them close to the edge of our culture, to what is current, to what is exciting, to what is stimulating, to what is changing and transforming so quickly in our world. But in moving forward, in giving forward, people talked about the need to go home to that place where they first were shaped, where they learned particular values, and that those values and those experiences very much guided how they then decided to give forward, to shape their future experiences. So I just want to end these opening comments by reading a short piece from the book about a man who's going home and giving forward, a journey that's full of familiarities and big surprises. Sometimes the journey home requires that people confront the ancient traumas of their childhood. People in their third chapters find that they do not want to live any longer with the hurts, the remorse, the guilt connected to their childhoods. Going home, metaphorically, psychologically, literally, spiritually, to face the old impediments becomes a way of moving forward with their lives and requires courage, resolve, patience, and new learning. Occasionally, my interviewees discovered the source and site of their early injuries in the course of our conversations together. All of a sudden, in the retelling of a story they had told many times before, they would stumble upon a detail, a metaphor, a sign or symbol that would unlock feelings that would open up a floodgate of tears. Or they would begin to replay an experience from their childhood, say a conversation with a parent or a teacher that they had always seen as positive and uplifting, and discover the dark underbelly, a reinterpretation of a practiced story that would suddenly bring forth the pain from the long ago injury. Stephen Fox had this kind of surprising revelation when I interviewed him. At 67, Stephen is a public health doctor who has spent his professional life doing epidemiological research in the lab and working in the rural regions of West Africa to eradicate malaria. Before going to medical school, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone, an experience which etched in him a lifelong commitment to international relief work. From an upper-middle-class African-American family, he has lived his life simply and with great humility, working behind the scenes to fight disease and oppression all over the world, always joining his professional engagement and expertise with his personal and moral commitments. He believes in thinking and acting, locally and globally. In a decision that snuck up on him, Stephen decided to sign up for voice lessons at the local community music school. This was a radical departure from his workaholic life, which had never left him the time or space to pursue pleasurable avocations, never left him any time to play. As he began to recount to me the story from his childhood that motivated his new passion for singing, what he called the big adventure of my third chapter, he discovered the subtle hurt carried in his mother's glance one Sunday afternoon when he was about 6. Stephen's favorite memory of early childhood is sitting on his mother's lap, listening to the radio when the Metropolitan Opera broadcasted their weekly performances. He had an immediate love affair, as he puts it, with opera and begged his mother to take voice lessons. She did not refuse him permission, but there was something in her eyes, a subtle dismissiveness that made Stephen withdraw his request. Somehow she made me feel like opera singing was something for sissies, he recalls sadly. Then when Stephen became a young adult, he himself decided that opera was too frivolous and aristocratic for someone who was devoting his life to changing the world. But a few years ago, he decided that he had denied himself long enough, and he secretly began taking voice lessons. This was the hardest, most exciting work I've ever done, simply thrilling, he says, about his first year of study in which he never produced a note that even vaguely resembled the luscious tones that he had heard across the airwaves 60 years before. The sound does not matter to Stephen, however. What matters is the chance he now has to live his dream, that is, as he puts it, the big turn on, and the high that comes with a freedom he has never known when he sings. What began as a benign and gentle story about being wrapped in his mother's arms, listening to opera, in the retelling during our interview, turns into a painful encounter with her disapproval of him. His tears catch up with him as he traces the connections between his recognition of the injury and his opportunity in the third chapter to heal the hurt with his voice. And one final surprise, an epiphany, really, that Stephen discovers in the retelling of this ancient tale. He begins to recognize that learning to sing, learning to breathe from his diaphragm, learning to use his body as a sound channel has somehow migrated into his work in public health. He is a better, stronger, more authoritative, more empathic doctor, he believes, now that he has liberated his voice. His giving forward in West Africa is becoming his beautiful and heartfelt aria. Thank you.
Wow. As was mentioned in the beginning by Pat, if you'd like to ask questions, if you'll come up here and just line up the center microphone, that will expedite things. Again, for our radio audience, you are joining us at the Cambridge Forum, and we are continuing our discussion of the third chapter, Passion, Risk, and Adventure in the 25 years after 50, with sociologist and author Sara Lawrence-Lightfoot of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Sara, I can't help but ask a very personal question in that I was a little bit ahead of the yuppies, but having had a father who was killed in the Second World War and a grandmother who just lived up the street here in Cambridge, every day when I came home from school, I went to see her. She had a very full icebox, and I know there was plenty of ice cream in there. But once I got through that, I'd sit with her, and she'd read to me, or she'd recite poetry or various other things. Very foreign to me, but I was just devoted to her and listening to this. And often, if I would really behave myself, I could stay for supper and listen to Lowell Thomas and the news, and all of that. Now, that went on for many years until I was finally sent off to school. But I was devoted to her and her model of an old person. And it just seemed to me that she and I were the same generation. And yet I lived in a world in which everybody sort of belittled, made fun of older people. And it wasn't the thing to do, or it wasn't quite as important as I felt it was. And as I listen to you and read the book and talk about suddenly recognizing, I mean, tonight you talked about adolescence as being of another century, but I'm just curious, did you feel this as you started to look at this third chapter? Did you feel that older people were either rebelling against this image, or that people were suddenly young people were catching on. There was some wisdom. I mean, how did you go through? And now that I'm 72, I'm so glad to hear about your mother. I'm going to call all my kids up. But I'm just curious how you got started in this business of recognizing not only perhaps our desire for wisdom, but the relationship and the feeling at ease and with older people. Or maybe there were just a bunch of us odd ducks here in Cambridge.
Well, as a matter of fact, I grew up in a household with my maternal grandparents. So I saw them every day. They were caretakers. I listened on and on and on and on to my grandfather's stories, which, I could now recite every word of them to you now. So I also grew up with this sense of old people as sort of reservoirs of experience, as caretakers, as relevant to my life. Although in my household, it was very clear, and my parents made it very clear, that it was they who were raising us and not my grandparents, because there were very different values that they wanted to sort of socialize us into. And so I think that this notion of talking to older people is not foreign to me at all. You use the word rebellion. Several of the people I talked to who had been boomers, who are boomers now, and who had been young people in the 60s, and in the streets, and involved in various kinds of civil engagement activities or rights activities, human rights activities, talked about their trying to transform the identity of themselves as older people alive in our culture as daily acts of resistance to a cultural norm that they were trying to challenge through their own personal lives. And sometimes that had to do with bringing their middle-aged children or their younger children up short, like my mother brought us up short, to say, I'm still growing. And sometimes that took the form of, in daily encounters, sort of correcting people's image of them in both explicit and subtle ways. I heard one of my friends, as we were leaving Whole Foods, which is not where I shop, but where she shops, yesterday, the young woman at the cash register called her sweetie pie. And she responded. She sort of jumped at this young woman and said, why are you calling me sweetie pie? She experienced it as diminishing. She experienced it as being demeaned or disrespected by this young person who was sort of looking down on her, sort of infantilizing an older person. And she immediately began to think, should I have let my hair grow white? This is a friend who's been dyeing her hair since she was 14, and just about 8 months ago decided that she would reveal that she has this absolutely gorgeous silver hair that just glistens. But this made her feel this was an act of speaking out against this perception of her, which she felt very personally.
One of the things we discovered when we started the Cambridge Senior Volunteer Clearinghouse, which now have over 3,000 seniors or people over 55 out volunteering, doing various things. But the interesting part was so many of us use sort of negative terms about ourselves. And so the word aging, we soon said we got to think of a better term. Well, we just said productive aging. Mm-hmm. Or that other bugaboo, retirement. Well, I think when you retire, theoretically, you turn your brain off and you stop. And I'm curious, as you pick these people and as you interview them, how did you go about the interview? Did you tell them what your scheme was, or did you just sort of sit down, as wonderfully you do, and they started talking?
No, I don't claim a random sample. I've stopped doing that 25 years ago, right? This is what sociologists smoothly refer to as a snowball sample, and it is purposeful and purposive. That is, you find a person who's learning something new and exciting, and you're coming to talk to them because that's what they're doing. and you want to investigate it. There are no hidden agendas here. And then once you finish talking to that person over a few weeks, you say to that person, do you know anyone else anywhere who's learning something new and exciting? And you go to that person. So in fact, a lot of my encounters with these folks began with observation. If they were doing something that was visible, learning that was visible, if they were beginning to train for a half marathon run, for example, and had never run before, if they were learning to play the jazz piano, I would sit right there by their side on the piano bench, or I would go with them to their piano lesson with a major jazz aficionado. I mean, in other words, someone who's becoming a portrait painter, I would sit in her studio with her and watch her work. Because one of the things about new learning is that it feels at first unfamiliar and inchoate. We don't have the words to describe what's happening to us, always. And so sometimes it's best to begin with watching, witnessing, observing, waiting, and then asking the impertinent question, the probing question about it, rather than the opposite. And not depending solely on people having good language to describe what it is they're doing.
The folks who believed in the Sun Belt and retirement or accepted getting to an age and headed out someplace, did you run into any of them, or did you? I think there's a dividing line between us crazies who didn't know how to stop. But it isn't just a matter of good health. It seems to me a kind of an attitude. And I'm wondering sort of what separates those who said, well, I'm going to play golf, and I'm going to go off to this wonderful leisure time when I can do whatever I want to do, which, in fact, the people in your book are doing just that. But for a very different reason.
Well, I think one of the things that separates, if I could think of one word that defines the difference, it is curiosity. That all 40 of these folks were sort of endlessly curious about the world around them and wanted to know what was happening over there and why and how come and how many and how much and how do I feel about that? How does she feel about that? Those kinds of almost primal questions that they want to ask about the world and they want to engage with in the world. And then I think that another thing that separates those people out is that I found was that somehow the folks I talked to were able to let go of the fear of doing the unknown, of doing something that wasn't predictable and wasn't familiar. So first, the fear of the unknown, and then secondly, the fear of failure, because it's certainly possible and probably probable that, in fact, they will, in taking on this new thing, fail many times. And they had to be prepared to fail, and they had to be prepared to learn from their failures, that failure was the best diagnostic, in fact, for learning how they learned. So they had to also make themselves or permit themselves to be vulnerable, exposed, and open to this failure. And I also think that there is a way in which all of these people had a sense of empathy for those who were their teachers and those who were their students, those who were inducting them into this new world, that they could begin to see those other folks, often younger people than themselves, as teachers and sort of stand in their shoes and experience their perspective. So I think curiosity, overcoming the fear of the unknown and the fear of failure, being open, allowing yourself to experience the embarrassment and humiliation of looking awkward, looking deficient, looking imbalanced, all of those things which are part of new learning. And of course, in response to all of that, laughter is the best thing, right? Humor saves us all as we try to struggle through those times.
I'm tempted, going back in my life as a teacher, to thinking of the traditional classroom where you knew who the teacher was because, A, they were in front of the classroom. They were usually on some sort of a little podium. and they completely control things like right answer, wrong answer, you're wrong, or mark. And then you've evolved, and you've helped this process to a classroom where there's a discussion going on. The teacher hopefully shows that he or she can make mistakes, sometimes purposefully to see if the kids are awake, but a whole new sort of attitude about what was teaching. And in fact, those who dared call themselves teachers knew that they had a lot to learn.
Right.
I mean, in that. And I'm wondering if, I want to say chicken, which came first here? Are we getting a new generation of teachers? Are we getting this group that you've talked about that sort of said, maybe we could do something about the Vietnam War? I mean, there's no one event, but it was really startling to me to, as you described the people who were graduated from college in the 60s and suddenly doing things that hadn't been done before. And I'd love to lay some of this at the feet of teachers, but I'm not quite sure how teachers got going,
Well,
except when you spoke to us.
It's interesting. I think that one of the things that a lot of people said was that they had to unlearn old school habits in order to be able to move forward and give forward and learn something new in the third chapter. In other words, school had taught them to be individualistic, to be achievement-oriented, to hide failure, to be cautious, to climb the ladder of success, to be competitive with their peers. I mean, that's really what school had taught them. Some people thought that school had taught them to dampen their curiosity, to stop asking unanswerable questions. But in this period of time, in the third chapter, they said in order to learn something new, they had to learn have completely other attributes and characteristics to their learning, to be cooperative, to be open, to be collaborative, it's not about speed, but it's often about patience and restraint, to be curious, to ask unanswerable questions, all of those things that they felt were in some ways a great contrast to, if not a great contradiction to the ways they had learned to behave in school and the attitudes they had developed to succeed in school. So, and that was a general sort of sense across most of the people, even those people, but particularly those people who had been very, very successful in school. One of the folks who talked about that most persuasively was a guy who's an industrial engineer, trained at a fancy school of technology, and not on this coast, but on the other. A Latino guy who, in fact, had gotten scholarships to the fanciest schools, first the fanciest preparatory schools, and then colleges, and then graduate schools, and become a really perfect, absolutely amazingly achieving student, and then went on in his work to do very, very successful work as well in his field. And at some point, decided to leave all of that and try to become a sculptor. His father in Mexico had also worked with clay, been an artisan and an artist, and he felt compelled to try sculpting. And one of the things he talked about was how he had learned to be a successful student, to hide his failure, to compete against his peers, to stand out in a way that was individualistic, never collective, but that part of becoming an artist in a studio was really taking criticism from one's peers that surrounded you, being able to ask for support, revealing your weaknesses and the challenges you had in making something, leading not with your head, but ultimately with your body and your hands and your muscle and your sinews. I mean, all of that was so contrary. So he was the one who said, I have to unlearn old school habits. And then he said it to me in Spanish, but I can't repeat that because I'm not Spanish speaking, in order to make it really plain that he was going home.
Please come forward if you have questions. I'm having a ball up here, but one other comment a question I wanted to ask is you keep talking about the paradox that we're dealing with, and in giving and living and serving forward is, again, a wonderful one, but you really have to think about it. we find that so many of the seniors who come over to the clearinghouse, when they feel comfortable, they talk about a huge sense of isolation, or like they've sort of been abandoned and they're not quite sure how to deal with this juxtaposition. Here I am, a senior, I should be revered, I should have something to do, and I've been left. And I'm just curious, when you came upon the idea of the paradox, did this just sort of bubble up that there were so many of these paradoxes and we just hadn't, as we were living them, figured that out? Or?
Well, I think that partly I'll reveal myself when I say that's one of the ways I always think about things, right? I think about ways in which we are doing different things at the same time that appear to be dissonant, but really we work to embrace those contradictions. And I think that's particularly present in this third chapter. But I also think that isolation is one of the things that a lot of people feel as they're trying to make this transition and become more generative. I mean, that's one of the impulses. They're trying to reduce their isolation, their feeling of marginality, their feeling of no longer being of use. And it begins to play so hard in their lives that they feel they must do something about it. And what they find they have to do is become engaged. So it's isolation versus engagement. Making that bridge, making that transition, it takes a lot of courage.
How can we, how will we, what things should we think about as we begin to rebuild community? Because I think we've been too much on our back porches watching TV and not enough engaged.
Right. You know, I think one of the things I think with building community is really working hard at this cross-generational conversation, discussion, encounter project. I think the most beautiful example of that that I participated in recently was the Obama campaign. You know, when I was up in New Hampshire for 3 weekends in a row, going from door to door with a 22-year-old Dartmouth student who thought he knew everything. And he did know a lot. He knew a great deal. The information, the kind of perspective, the energy, the urgency, the technical stuff, he had it all. But he absolutely didn't have a clue about listening. He had no idea who he was talking to. It was the same script at every front door. And to watch us, I wish I could have watched us and not been so intensely and intensely involved in this. To watch us negotiate what we each had to bring to this project. He with his information, he with his knowledge, he with his speed, he with his impatience and urgency and energy, and me with my restraint. Beautiful. I mean, if you say to me, what do you like best about yourself now? I would say, my restraint. Right? Knowing when to push, to act, to move, to pursue, and knowing when to sit back and watch and wait and have faith and believe. And we were struggling with that in this project together. And I emerged feeling as if I not only knew this young man, Matthew, better, but I knew his generation better. And I felt as if I was representing our generation quite well in this encounter. And I think more and more of those opportunities. And I think when Obama asked us to be engaged in social service and sacrifice and giving forward, he's imagining people working cheek to jowl, side by side, watching each other's backs, people of different generations, from different geographies, right? From different races and classes, moving together. And I think that's, to me, one of the opportunities for community building. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm kind of fortunate at this point in my life to be able to be in a position like the gentleman that you mentioned earlier, to working with clay, because I work in a public school right now. And I've been an educator for about 45 years, and I've seen the chaos of kindergarten and the struggle of adult learners as well. So I've had a broad range of experience. And in all of that time, talking to one educator at a meeting I was at one day, he said something very profound to me. He said, the easiest way for us to solve our educational problem would be if the parents were allowed one day off from work, paid day off from work, to visit their child's school for the day and sit in the class with that child for the entire day. That, I think, as an idea was profound. And it would, I think, turn around what is a common problem in schools, which is respect, which you mentioned in your material. We missed that opportunity back in the 70s. That's when I heard that comment from that educator. But I think from what you're saying now, we have a room full of people here and a whole demographic that have the capability of going back to school, to re-engaging. And why are we not, as senior citizens, going to high school again, sitting in the classrooms with our grandchildren, finding out what they're learning, finding out why they're not learning, finding out what's wrong with the teachers, what's right with the teachers. And I'm certain that, I certainly know that my principal would welcome the opportunity for each and every one of us to come to school and perhaps even take a class with the sophomores who are taking biology. And use the effort, use the knowledge, use the experience we have to invest again in what is perhaps the most important demographic, is the young people today who are faced with a world that we've fouled up in one way or another, from an energy point of view, from an environmental point of view, that we might have a chance to engage them and maybe turn them around and get the kind of rewards that I think you're talking about that we can get in this later section of our lives.
I think that's a great idea, and I want to tell you that when you read my book, I spend a great deal of time talking about that as a possibility. Not only older adults, which is apparently the correct term for us now, older adults, not seniors, not elders, but older adults, people in the movement say. Or all the other terms are discriminatory, right? Not only older adults coming into schools and working with students, listening to them, teaching them, learning from them, but also in the opposite direction, young people having the opportunity to spend some time in the world, what my kids used to call the wide, wide world, learning in an apprentice way with those of us working on various projects outside. And I think one of that's also having to do with all the social service activities that kids are now involved in. So making the boundaries of this institution we call school more permeable, welcoming different generations in, but also having students be able to move out into the world as well. And so I think that's happening more and more. That's certainly happening in colleges and community colleges, where if you go, I spent a lot of time in community college classrooms following people out into those places where there were people of all generations learning something new. Thank you.
Speaking of restraint, what advice would you have for people in the audience who can think of one or two people in our families who we think really, really, really need your book? But
buy them 3 books. Really, really, really.
But we're not so sure they want your book. Or to put it in more concrete terms, how do I give this book to my father for his birthday without being presumptuous?
I couldn't begin to answer that question because I don't know the nature of your relationship to your father. But I would take a leap of faith. I would gather your courage and gird your loins and just take this book wrapped beautifully with some flowers, and say, this is your gift, your gift. And I think that the other thing that I think, taken from that early story of my mother Margaret at 72, the other thing that should accompany the gift of the book is your asking some questions, beginning a conversation in which you really are trying to understand who he is and who he is becoming. And to begin to think about how you might start that conversation. There is no greater aphrodisiac, I am sure, for any parent, no matter what the relationship, than hearing from your child, whatever the age, this question about who are you really? Now, and this question about, I want to know what you're up to. I want to know how you're feeling. You know, if either of my children begin to ask me that line of question, I just stop in my tracks, feeling as if they've learned, we've come full circle. I've asked them these questions. I've been in the position of nourishing them through my great interest in them, my great passion and love for them, my great curiosity about who they are becoming. Wow. And they've learned to do a back at you to me. And that just feels loving and good. So I bet that if you can figure out how to initiate that set of questions, along with the flowers and the beautifully wrapped book, it's going to be a good birthday.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank
First
you.
of all, I want to thank you for being so gorgeous.
I accept that.
For real. Secondly, this is the third time I've seen you. The first 2 times we were at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute workshops at Harvard with Professor Ogletree.
Ogletree.
Thirdly, I came tonight with 2 women I absolutely love. One is 37.
Waving back there.
Right. One is 47, and I'm 67. Do you think that one of the things that prevents men and women of my age, or our age, I don't know, you look like you're in your 40s, prevents us from garnering the courage and the tenacity to move forward as we grow and go on, is that the word old has been so disturbing and deteriorating to us that when we hear that label, we think disturbing and deteriorating, and it forces us to muster courage beyond all means to get over the word old, because we're not an old shoe or an old car, and we're not antiques. So I wanted to present that.
Thank you. It seems like you're doing very, very well. I don't think I have any advice for you. I think you've gotten over, you've had the courage and the tenacity, your words, to embrace this notion that you grow more beautiful and more sexy and more fine and wiser with each passing year, and you've absolutely moved way past that exit that called you old.
Another question, are you doctor or
Professor. Hi.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
With the people that you interviewed, because of their passion that they were discovering in and for themselves, did you query them as to how that passion began to change their relationships with their significant others, husbands, wives, and so forth? And how did they cope with that? And did some of the relationships fail because of their newfound discovery of themselves? Did it become deeper? How did that all sort of come together?
Right. Wonderful question. I think that it's clear that it's easier to take the leap of faith, to move forward with new learning and reinvention, taking on new adventures, if you have a partner, a spouse, a lover, a bunch of friends, or even your children who are saying, go for it, who are supporting you in this quest, who are surrounding you and cheerleading for you, right? Cheering you on. And that makes it much easier. But in lots of cases, that's not what happens. Clearly, these new adventures threaten many relationships. where the original contract seemed to be one thing, that we would be this way with one another, that this would be our contract, of our relationship, and someone taking off and doing something different, or defining themselves differently, or inevitably entering into a different set of relationships with folks, feels like a threat. And people talked about having to renegotiate with one another and figure out how to both permit the other person to leave and figure out, and I think there were people who talked about that more openly than others, but everyone talked about the worry of the stress, the worry and anxiety of leaving the person to whom you felt committed to, in some sense, stay the same. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but at all, but stay the person that they recognize and that feels familiar. One of the people I talked to said something very interesting in terms of sort of male-female impulse here. He is a guy who has made a lot of money in the stock market and who at 67 is deciding to pull way back from work, completely back from work. And he put it this way. He said, "As I row into shore, I can't wait to get home. I can't wait to get home. And then he said, I even want to empty the dishwasher." I mean, you know, we all know men who fill the dishwasher, but does anyone know a man who empties the dishwasher? Anyway, I don't want to get personal with you all. But that's what he used as an example for how much he wanted to be in the embrace of domesticity, really. But he said, as I'm rowing into shore, I look to my left, and there's my wife in a canoe, and she's paddling out to sea. This sense that they really were on different paths, had different agendas, and that part of the work of returning home was being able to say to her, Godspeed, right? You go for it, and we'll manage our way through this. I mean, and these were, I'm almost using his exact words as I talk about that. Yes, sir.
Hi, Professor Lightfoot. First
Yes.
of all, I want to thank you for such a wonderful book. It's great to hear you again. And I think this is a perfect moment for this book because of, I think, the president calling all of Americans really be engaged in public service. I think that we'll have quite, I think the seniors or older adults have a big role to play.
Now, which chapter are you in, may I be?
I don't know. So my question is, I come from Uganda, and all over Africa, older people actually really taken seriously, and they are very special. So when I came here to America, I was very surprised at my age to be also called as if I was a senior citizen, because I think older people here are not taken as seriously as in other cultures. And I wonder, because America is always the world leader in sending the message out there, but I think this is one of the flaws of America. So I'm wondering, in your book, did you consider or looking at other cultures where older people are really precious and taken seriously and they can contribute to society?
Yeah. I think it would have been wonderful if I had done that. My book is really investigating folks who live in this country. It does talk about other cultures where people who are older adults are obviously revered and listened to, are considered the wise ones who bring the memory of the culture with them, and who deserve respect. Not only have earned respect, but deserve respect from all those around them. So I think that's one of the kind of qualities of your culture, Ugandan culture, all over Africa and lots of other countries in this world, where that's the case, where as we get older, we get wiser, we get more valued, we are precious, right, to the continuity of society. And we are there as well, because one of the other things that I've seen in traveling all over the world, and certainly spending some time in East and West Africa and South Africa, is that the other thing that older people do is they listen. to younger people. That is, they're dispensing wisdom, but there is this kind of patience and this space and this receptivity to listen to what young people are saying, to answer those questions. So I think that part of the reverence comes from the expectation that this person cares deeply about you, thinks you're worthy, and sees themselves in your future, right? I had a wonderful set of encounters just this past week, if you can imagine, in Miami, Florida, where I was there for a literary arts festival, and part of what the festival did was send those authors at the Literary Arts Festival out to schools to talk to others. And I was sort of speaking to three high school groups in different schools. And we were each supposed to talk about our books, and I thought, this is irrelevant. My book is irrelevant to these kids. So I really talked to them about my work, and I talked about teaching, and I talked about writing, and I talked about balancing work and love and work and family. I just wanted to give them a sense of my life and how I put it together. But a lot of time was spent talking about teaching. And the last question at the last school was from a beautiful young brown-skinned woman. I don't know whether she was Latina or whether she was African-American or some wonderful mix. But she said, when you're teaching, do you ever look into the eyes of your student and see yourself? And that's what I think of. That's what I think of when I think of the reverence given the wise one in Uganda. It isn't just the wise one who earns respect and who deserves it, but it's that they are in return giving respect to the young person and seeing that person's future, in that person's eyes, their future.
Hi, I'm a psychotherapist, a member of this generation, and also work with people who are also members of the generation. And you've spoken about in your work, many people, the examples you've given are people have been very successful in their lives. And I'm wondering about any thoughts you have about people who really define their earlier chapters as failures. They feel themselves to have they don't feel as successful as parents, as workers in different ways. And they're coming to this point, and they may not be coming with the confidence of of a successful, high-achieving person. And I was just wondering if you have thoughts about making that transformation when you're coming from kind of a different place as one looks back over the years before this chapter.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would just make one correction, that is that although most of the people in my book had a sense of, I would say, perceived abundance. They weren't all affluent or wealthy. They weren't all terribly successful in material terms. But they had a sense that they had choices, that they had alternatives. And some of them were really lived fairly modestly. And many of them came from working class backgrounds and poor backgrounds. But they were all, you're right, relatively well educated. I think that one of the things that I've gathered actually since being out on the road talking about my book, it's been out for a couple of months, since mid-January, and I've been on maybe 20 NPR shows around the country. Now, to be on an NPR show now, it's wonderful because you can sit in your study and in what my grandmother used to call her dishables, that is in your sweatsuit or in your pajamas, and you can be on the radio for an hour anywhere in the country. And one of the things about these hour-long shows is that the first half hour is devoted to a smart, thoughtful interviewer who's read your book and asked probing questions. And the second half hour is really devoted to people coming on the airwaves and asking questions. And one of the things which I've discovered, really across all of these shows, and there are at least 20 or 25 I've been on, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dallas, Texas, right? San Francisco. And they mostly happen as people are driving to work right? Is two things. People come on, whether they're men or women, whatever background they're coming from, whatever kind of work they're doing, and they say this: you're talking about me. You're talking about me. And then they begin to tell their story. They don't ask me a question. I don't talk for I don't talk for the second half hour. And what's impressive is people coming forward who are working people, who have been fired from their factory jobs, and who are making a new life, or people who talk about a life, an early life, that was hard, not necessarily poverty-stricken, but hard in emotionally hard and difficult, where they weren't given much credit or much support or much unconditional love, and how this is a moment for turning that around. And it's just interesting how, at least from their rendition of their stories, this is a time that welcomes risk, where people, I think, begin to say, why be cautious? What am I being cautious about? Let me go for it. You know, I'm tired of the inhibitions of my past, the restraints, the constraints, the ways in which I punish myself because I was punished by others. Let me breathe free. Let me move forward. And people use this language, you know, take a leap of faith, do something for myself. As someone said on the radio this morning, I was in Ohio this morning, and someone said, a woman said, I'm a working person, right? I don't have much time to myself. I'm a grandmother and I'm a mother. And I do domestic work. And she talked about at the Holiday Inn, the local Holiday Inn. And she talked about the fact that she knew she was worth more than that. And she knew there must be some kids who had less than she did, even as a child, that she could help. And she had begun working in some daycare centers, doing volunteer work in daycare centers in the time that she wasn't doing her work at the hotel. And she said, and the other thing that I'm doing is I'm going to the gym. My heroine, she said, is Michelle Obama. I'll never have arms like Michelle, she said, but I'll tell you what Michelle says, Professor. Michelle says, take care of yourself first, then you can take care of others, she said. And that's tell me the word, she said, I want to use. And I said, mantra. She said, that's right. That's my mantra. So I think that people discover resources they never imagined, and they grow tired of themselves as being afraid, as being reticent, as being somehow burdened and inhibited by a past that they can't undo, but a future that they can make.
Sara, thank you.